You've been told a story about civilization. It goes like this. Humans were scattered, wandering, fighting for scraps, and then one day someone discovered farming and everything got better. People settled down, built houses, and life slowly improved from there. That story is in your old school books, and for the last 100 years, archaeologists have been quietly finding evidence that it is not quite true. Farming did not arrive as a gift. It arrived as a trap. And once you see what civilization actually is, you start to notice a pattern. Every civilization humans have ever built has followed the same arc. It rises, it grows, it gets too big to feed itself the old way, so it grabs more, and eventually it collapses under its own weight. Villages, empires, kingdoms, the world you live in now. The same story, over and over, for thousands of years. This is the entire history of civilization, and it ends somewhere you are not going to expect. So where did it begin? Long before cities, before kings, before writing, humans lived in small groups, moving with the seasons, following animals and plants. For most of human existence, this is simply how people lived. Then, in a few scattered places around the world, something changed. People started staying in one spot and growing their own food. We call this the start of farming, and we are taught it was an upgrade. But the bones tell a different story. Early farmers were often shorter, sicklier, and worked harder than the hunters before them. Farming did not make life easier. It made life more controllable. A wandering group cannot be taxed. A farm can. And once you have a farm that cannot move, you also have something worth taking. As farming spread, people who once lived freely found themselves tied to the land. Crops needed defending, stores needed guarding, and someone had to organize all of that. So, small leaders appeared, then bigger ones. Villages grew into towns, and towns grew into the first cities. In places like the river valleys of the ancient world, thousands of people began living closer together than humans ever had before. With that closeness came something new: writing. Not for poetry, not for stories, but for counting. Counting grain, counting workers, counting debts. The earliest writing we have found is mostly lists. Civilization, it turns out, did not begin with art. It began with bookkeeping. Once you can write things down, you can also write down rules, and rules need someone to enforce them. This is where kings come in. The first rulers often claimed they were chosen by the gods, or were gods themselves. This was not just for show. If people believed a ruler was placed there by something bigger than themselves, they were far less likely to question being told what to do. Religion and power fused into the same idea early on, and they have rarely separated since. From here, the pattern speeds up. Cities competed for land, water, and workers. Competition turned into armies, and armies turned into empires. The first great empires were not built to spread culture or ideas, mainly. They were built to control trade routes and collect resources from conquered lands. Every empire that followed this same shape: grow, take, defend, and eventually stretch too far. Rome is the most famous example. At its height, it controlled an enormous stretch of land, with roads connecting it all together. But controlling that much land is expensive. Soldiers need paying, borders need defending, and the cost of holding everything together kept climbing. When the money and the army could no longer keep pace with the size of the empire, the cracks began to show, and eventually, the whole structure came apart. While Rome was falling apart in the West, other civilizations were rising in the East. Empires in China, in the Middle East, and later across other parts of the world followed a strikingly similar path. A strong leader unites a region. Trade brings wealth. That wealth attracts rivals and invaders. And over time, the empire either bends or breaks. Sometimes it breaks completely. Sometimes it bends, and a new ruling group simply takes over the same system. Either way, the underlying machine, farms, taxes, soldiers, and rulers, kept running underneath whoever happened to be in charge. Then came a turning point that changed everything again. A handful of countries in Europe built ships capable of crossing oceans, and they used them to reach distant lands. What followed was not a friendly meeting of cultures. It was conquest on a scale the world had never seen. Entire civilizations in the Americas, with populations larger than many countries in Europe at the time, were devastated within a few generations, partly through violence and partly through diseases that arrived with the newcomers. Resources flowed back across the oceans, and that wealth helped fuel the next great shift. That shift was the rise of machines. For thousands of years, human and animal muscle had been the main source of power. Then, engines arrived that could run on coal, and everything sped up. Factories appeared, cities exploded in size, and for the first time, a small number of countries could produce more goods than the rest of the world combined. This gave them enormous power, and they used it to build colonial empires that stretched across entire continents. The pattern was the same as ancient Rome, just on a global scale, and powered by steam instead of soldiers marching on foot. The 20th century saw this system strain to breaking point twice, in two massive wars that pulled in countries from every continent. After the second of these wars, the old colonial empires began to fall apart, and dozens of new countries appeared on the map almost overnight. But the underlying machine did not disappear. It simply changed shape again. Instead of empires controlling land directly, a smaller number of countries and companies began controlling trade, technology, and money instead. The borders on the map changed. The basic pattern, a powerful center drawing resources from a wider periphery, did not. Today, civilization looks nothing like a small farming village, and yet it runs on the exact same foundations. Food still has to be grown, resources still have to be extracted, and someone still has to organize all of it. The difference is scale. A handful of global supply chains now feed, clothe, and power billions of people, all balanced on a system that depends on constant growth to keep functioning. And just like every civilization before it, that growth cannot continue forever. Soils wear out, resources run low, and the climate itself is starting to push back against a system built on the assumption that there would always be more to take. Civilization began as a way to organize people so a few could control many. Every layer added since then, writing, religion, empire, industry, has mostly built on top of that same idea. The question that humans have faced again and again at the start of every farm, every city, and every empire is the same one we face now. Who controls the resources that everyone depends on? And what happens when those resources are no longer enough to go around? History suggests that question is never answered quietly.